Hello everyone, and welcome to the third Deep Questions Q&A with Saif. And today we have an especially interesting question, as all the most popular videos on the channel revolve around jhana. This will be the topic of today's video. And the question is as follows. The Buddha called the first jhana the foundation of liberation and said that it is entirely wholesome and sufficient for liberation. Why is it then that some suttas speak of a drawback and danger in the first jhana, likewise the second and the third and the fourth and so on? Yeah, I think that's a very interesting question. You want to start? Should I start?
Sure. I mean, I can just say, just as a preamble, um, it's a difficult question to answer, I feel like, because of the nature of the Buddhist discourse, where the word jhana just has multiple different meanings. So there's a risk that we're talking past one another, because every single person listening to this will probably have a different interpretation of jhana. So maybe just to start with, probably just say the interpretation that we're working with is um, centered around jhana being the result of basically the entire gradual training. So that purification that comes from following virtue, sense restraint, purification of body, mind, speech, basically at the level of one's um, entire life, and not based around just one single meditation session. So yeah, the calm, the tranquility, the unification of mind that comes from living the entire life devoid of craving. Um, that's the jhana that we're interested in, uh, because obviously um, it's something which can carry with you during your entire life, and also it's a more suitable basis then to jump towards nibbana, which is the freedom that is constant no matter what situation you're in. Um, so I guess that's just a preamble to start with. But do you want to start with answering the question?
I'm sure I can do that. Well, first of all, I think it's very good that you made that clear. I think there are a few other videos on the channel and lots of videos in our previous Q&A series where we also talk about that. So in case you are not on par with our definition here, you can always go back to those videos. You will usually find some jhana in the title, and then it should be good. Yeah. Okay, then have a look at the few parts of this question. First of all, the first part of the question contains the word wholesome and entirely wholesome, even. And I think it's important to make a distinction there, because even in the suttas, there are at least, let's say, two kinds of jhanas mentioned. One jhana of wanderers of other sects, that they were factually practicing. They were factually doing some jhana practice, as I understand it at least. Sometimes up to the fourth jhana, sometimes even more, in the case of the teachers of the Buddha. And then there are the jhanas that the Buddha himself taught to his followers. That type of jhana is not only a jhana, but it is a jhana with the right view. The jhana which is connected to the past, connected to the Four Noble Truths, which has that as a foundation. So only in conjunction with the Four Noble Truths and wisdom will the jhana that is mentioned in the suttas lead to liberation. And in that sense, if we interpret the word wholesome as leading towards liberation, then only then will it actually carry you towards liberation. Otherwise, the direction is a good one, but it will not carry you all the way there. Let's put it like that. And it can only serve as a foundation for liberation if the necessary wisdom is already there. So that is some important aspect that I want to highlight. It can be a bit difficult to understand, but then the jhana is entirely wholesome. And then it is a state that is without craving. And when you dwell in a state without craving for a very long time, then the benefits and the positive aspects will become more and more the normal mode of being. And at some point, if you spend enough time in that state, it will become permanent, but only based on that wisdom. Otherwise, the dormant roots of self-view and everything else will lead to a re-arising of craving in the future. That should be avoided. So that would be another disclaimer on the first part of the question. Do you want to have a go at the second part?
Yeah, I
Or
mean, I think you even started to almost start talking about the second part in terms of the drawbacks of jhana, because if there's a difference between jhana plus the wisdom and right view that actually leads then towards nibbana, if you don't have that right view aspect and you're only dwelling in jhana, which is in itself wholesome. I mean, the Buddha did talk about the fact that, those other people who talk about us as devoted to pleasure, they should be told, yes, we are devoted to the pleasure of the four jhanas, which is wholesome. But it's not permanent in itself, unless it has the right view. And the right view obviously being that wisdom of dependent origination, understanding impermanence, dukkha, not self. And then once that sense of self has been entirely let go of, then there's just no return to the craving. But if you're just dwelling in the first jhana, the second jhana, the third jhana, the fourth jhana, without that extra transcendent wisdom, then it is ultimately an impermanent state. It might last for days, weeks, months, years, basically, depending on the sort of strength and your mode of life. But the way the Buddha described it was like if there's like a dirty street with leaves and dirt all thrown over it, and you clean it and fully purify it, and it's a nice clean road, that does not mean then that in the future it won't get dirty again if the weather changes or someone comes and throws some dirt on it. And that's basically what the jhana is like. Unless it's combined with that transcendent wisdom, the underlying roots by which the hindrances could arise in the future are still present. And that's why it's really important, like the distinction we always make between reducing craving and uprooting craving. Uprooting craving is always about the roots of suffering. And unless you have wisdom, then the jhanas do have that drawback, that they're not yet that permanent, unconditioned release. I'm not sure if the question is asking about like the danger of first jhana that leads to second jhana, or the danger in jhana in general that leads it towards nibbana. But yeah, the way I'm speaking about it is just the danger in jhana in general that one should contemplate, as it is in the sutras, like consider anything within the jhana as a dart, as a boil, as dangerous. That would lead the mind to nibbana, basically.
I think there's also another sutta, which is called the Thorn or something, where the Buddha explains a succession of steps. Like it first starts with there's noise, which is a thorn in the first jhana, and then the first jhana being a thorn in the second jhana being a thorn in the third jhana, and so on. That question very much reminds me of that sutta, where people basically argue that you have to let go of the first jhana, etc. And I think that is maybe also part of that question. Maybe we should also tackle that. So what would be your take on that one? Why could an entirely wholesome state be a hindrance even? Or even has a drawback? But sounds strange to probably someone external who has not yet fully grasped that, I guess.
Yeah, I guess the differentiation we could make here is the hindrances, aka the five hindrances, that have to do with craving and therefore of suffering, if we're calling it suffering, and then the hindrances that we can call the hindrances to calm, which are two different things. So the first jhana is completely empty of the hindrances that have to do with craving and have to do with suffering, which means that the first jhana is entirely without suffering in that sense. But it is a hindrance in the sense that it could be further calm, but that calm does not necessarily have to do with suffering. And the distinction needs to be made there because when you're in first jhana, it's not like the drawback is not like a thing where you're dwelling it in there for some time, and then that jhana becomes a state of suffering, and it's like, okay, I've been dwelling in it for like a few months now, and now it's just getting boring. Now I'm going to go towards the second jhana. It's not like that. It's fully wholesome. Like if you were to become dissatisfied with it, you would be going lower than first jhana because you would be re-entering the domain of the hindrances. So there's never a time while you're in the first jhana where you're like, okay, this is getting unsatisfying and I need to go towards the second jhana and the third jhana now. It's more like as you're dwelling in there, you start to notice, even though I'm fully free of the non-calm and the suffering that comes from the craving hindrances, the mind could be more calm. if it would like to, basically. And then you start to basically discern the parts of your experience that are a bit more slightly agitating, slightly more related to multiplicity, to movement, to change. So, for example, in the first jhana, there's obviously the thinking and pondering mind. Thinking and pondering is not all suffering. And while you're in first jhana, it'll never be the case where you're like, this thinking is a state of suffering. It's just that, if I wanted to, I could dwell in an even more calm state. And then if you then dwell in second jhana, which is then devoid of the thinking and pondering, you will be able to see from that perspective that, that thinking and pondering was slightly more agitating than a state that I'm in now. But the point is that you have to make that differentiation between the hindrances of craving, which is where suffering is, and the hindrances that have to do with calm. Because if you confuse them, that's where you get into the states of the Buddha's former teachers, where they started to identify the degree of their liberation with their degree of jhana, basically. So they just thought, okay, first jhana, there's a certain degree of freedom, and then second jhana, now I'm even more free. Third jhana, I'm even more free, and they just see how high they can go. But in the Buddha's doctrine, you don't have to go further than first jhana, because the problem, which is craving, has already been done away with in the first jhana. So that's, as the question suggests, entirely sufficient for full liberation. It was a bit of a wayward answer there, but I think I answered the point.
I think it perfectly answers the question. I guess a different angle from which you could answer that question is that you can speak of the different jhanas and different modes of being, even in terms of the speed at which they lead to a liberation, in a sense. So if you have a lifestyle that is full of work and full of social engagement and full of duties, pretty much, then it does not leave much time to practice for you. It can still lead you in the right direction, very much so. All the time that is left, you can still dwell without any craving, without any sensual engagement, but it will be a slower mode of practice than as if you would spend more time in jhana. And the second jhana would be, well, faster in a sense than the first jhana when it comes to that. And the third jhana would even be more faster. But in essence, all the modes of being still lead to the same direction. And they will guarantee arrival pretty much. It is just that they arrive there at different speeds. As long as you have the right view, that is. Otherwise, there is not this sloping and inclining towards Nibbana that the Buddha and the Suttas are always talking about. That's another way that I like to think of it. But that's pretty much all that I can really offer there when it comes to that question. Maybe you have another different take.
Yeah, I mean, what you say is basically why, like, the jhanas, even though the first is sufficient for liberation in a sense, like, they normally always come as 1, 2, 3, 4, because even though the first is sufficient for liberation, that further calm that we're talking about, it is helpful to get even more perspective, basically, in regards to experience. If you go even more higher up the mountain, the view that you get about what's going on beneath, you'll have even more perspective in regards to it. So you'll be able to see as even more clearly as impermanent, as dukkha, as not self. So it is nice to basically go towards all 4 jhanas. And if you're dwelling in the first jhana, you're dwelling in the satisfaction of the first jhana, the mind will slope towards second, third, and fourth jhana anyways, because that's just the nature of just dwelling in the calm. The mind will just get even more calmer if you dwell in the satisfaction of it. Which is why, like, the Buddha gave that simile with the cows who tried to go towards the next field to basically eat, or I can't remember what exactly it is, but it's basically the Buddha was saying that, if you try to go too fast when you haven't got used to his own area, then he will neither get the second area nor the first area. And it's basically the same when you're in the first jhana. If you don't get used to the first jhana, dwell in it, become satisfied in it, understand the length of it, the distinction of it, and you try to get too fast and be like, okay, let me get to the second jhana, and the way we were talking about before, then you will neither get second jhana nor first jhana, because you're now reintroducing that restlessness that's part of non-jhana. So you have to just dwell in the first jhana, and there's not a point where it's like, okay, let me now enter the second jhana. It's just the more you engage in the satisfaction of the first jhana, the more you basically sink into that satisfaction. And you turn even more further away from the non-jhana, the sensuality, the ill will. And then as you sink more into it, body gets calmer, thoughts start to cease, rapture starts to fade. So fourth jhana is basically natural culmination of just dwelling in the first jhana. So even though the first jhana is fully sufficient for liberation, they normally come as 1, 2, 3, 4 because they all basically come together if you dwell in it for long enough.
Yeah, very well. I think maybe we should rephrase it with danger when it comes to first jhana in this context. It's not actually dangerous to dwell in the first jhana. It's very wholesome. It's leading you towards liberation. It will get the job done if you spend enough time in it. But there might be a more natural, a faster, a more enjoyable or agreeable way towards liberation that your mind will naturally slope and incline towards. Maybe a good summary when it comes to that part. However, to the first part, where we actually have the jhana without the right view, that is factually dangerous. If you spend time in that and think yourself to be done with the practice, and that's pretty much it, then that is a problem. And that is very dangerous and should be avoided.
Yeah. Well, I don't know how you would say it. I probably wouldn't say it's dangerous in itself. It's dangerous, like you say, if you think it's liberation.
Yeah.
So it's about the view that's
Yeah.
dangerous, right? But the jhana itself is still the same. It's still like the most wholesome foundation. And it's something that the Buddha never ceased to recommend. So yeah, like the Buddha says, it leads exclusively to dispassion, but you just have to have the right understanding in regards to it, which is to go even further towards seeing even that as impermanent, as dukkha, as not self, as dependent originated, basically.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It is always the view that is a problem. That is true. Yeah, the jhana is always nice. But again, we must distinguish between the real jhanas, let's say, I have no better word than that, and the modern styles of absorption. Those are not always wholesome, even if people refer back to the suttas, where the Buddha pretty much praises all the jhanas. It's just that the word jhana can mean various different things, and not all of them are wholesome. It is, strictly speaking, only this one type of jhana, which is a dwelling without craving, that is fully wholesome. And everything else is not fully wholesome. And as Saif said in many of the older videos, if the state that you call jhana is very limited by a certain sit on the cushion, then it's very likely not as a jhana that the suttas talk about, because you pretty much have to be free all the time if you want to get closer to nibbana. If you think of nibbana as perfect freedom and jhana as partial freedom where samsara can regrow or something, then whatever your dwelling mode is, it should carry you closer towards the real deal and not further away. But yeah. Anything else you want to add to that question?
Not really. I mean, I can only reiterate that, yeah, our position, I guess, is that it is fundamentally something that should be aimed for and developed no matter which stage you are in the practice, because it is an intrinsic part of the Noble Eightfold Path. So you can't get enlightenment without it, first of all. And secondly, if you're practicing it rightly, which is like as Flau said, not in like a limited state where it's just this state you enter on for an hour or two, because it's pretty impermanent. But it is concentration, a singleness of mind that you're enjoying because you're living your life devoid of craving. That's just always wholesome. And it completely agrees where in the sutras where the Buddha talks about it being entirely wholesome. And he says, yes, think of yourselves as devoted to pleasure, because this pleasure is the one that leads exclusively to disenchantment. Like we talked a lot about before about the nature of the relationship between concentration and insight. So, if you're dwelling in the jhana, the nature of sensuality is going to become very, very palpably clear. So that insight will just become just like that. And it's the same for the nature of, the body being impermanent and so on. If you're no longer taking it up in that sort of self-centered way through your craving, and you're dwelling in non-activity, and you've just got this basically almost motionless body while these thoughts are appearing by themselves, and you're not taking them up as you are in jhana, then yeah, the whole mind-body complex is going to be so easily seen as impermanent, as not yours. So yeah, dwell in jhana. There is no danger in it in that sense. It's wholesome.
I can't remember who said that, but one of the people on the Discord compared samadhi with water. With our normal mind is like muddy water, and we can't see through it. We cannot attain insight, while the water is very muddy. But if we calm it by samadhi, so to speak, when there's no longer the waves of craving crashing in from all sides and stirring up the mud in the water, then it will be very clear, and all you need is a sentence from another person who has understood, and you will pretty much get all the insights, or at least the insight into independent origination that you need. So I found that very good as a comparison. You can always try to see harder through your efforts at discerning, but if the water is still very, very muddy, then you will only see a limited way.
Yeah. And that's why, like, in the sutras, when you get those people that basically become enlightened straight away, it's normally because they're like already ascetics, they're already sort of purified in mind. So even a sentence would just evolve that samadhi into samadhi plus wisdom, and it'll just result in the destruction of the defilements. So it's probably also the case that, you know, we're talking about getting stuck in jhana without right view. But you know, if someone today is like reading sutras, they're hearing about this idea of impermanence and dependent origination, and they're also purifying their mind to the point of first jhana, it's extremely, extremely likely, I would say, that they will develop right view along the way. It's not like you are back in the days, like practicing asceticism before the Buddha arose or before you met the Buddha, where you had never heard about things like not self and you were practicing jhana. Today, everyone's heard of not self. So if you're purifying your mind to the degree of first jhana, which is, as the Buddha would say, a supramundane degree, it is like very, very lofty, basically. It does require basic transformation of your entire life. By that point, the view will most likely be purified along with it. So the idea of like get to jhana first and then do like some special drawback contemplation, it's probably not relevant to most people. It's probably along the way you're also developing the drawbacks in general of any state of being, because that's what you've been taught by the Buddha. And you know, it's also what we talk about in these videos all the time, like dependent origination, just like seeing every single state of being as conditioned by this impermanent body that you don't own. Yeah, that will just lead to you automatically seeing even jhana as impermanent while you're enjoying it, right?
Yeah. In a sense, the modern jhana descriptions turn the order of the paths upside down. They put first, which is actually second, and second, which is actually first. So the concentration, as we see it, comes last on the path, pretty much, once the purification is more or less complete, except for the permanentness of it, and not some preparatory exercise. We say that virtue is pretty much what you do first, and clarifying your view on dependent origination and the Four Noble Truths. And then, as a result, you will attain Sama Samadhi, and not the other way around. That you only start contemplating when you have already attained pretty much everything. That does not make sense, at least from my view.
Yeah, like the way you talked about it there with the virtue coming first, it's very consonant with all those sutras where to talk about the fact that you don't need to exercise your will in terms of developing concentration insight. It's a very, very, very natural process in terms of developing virtue, purification of body, mind, speech, leads naturally to joy, tranquility, calm, seeing the nature of things. It all happens so clearly and automatically, without this exercising of the will, where like, you know, let me do this first jhana first, and then let me practice my insight practice of seeing really carefully into reality. I mean, like when I used to practice that, it was basically me hoping that some insight would appear. But it never really led to that purification on the level we're talking about, where you're basically purified at the level of your entire life. It was basically me hoping I would have some insight, and then that would basically automatically happen. By having some insight, I would then just be free from sensuality. I just wouldn't go back to it. But ultimately, you do have to do that work, and it's more difficult that way of withdrawing from sensuality, purifying yourself from body, speech, and mind. But the results are much more immediate, because you're actually doing the work and you're not hoping for it to happen sometime in the future. But yeah, I like the idea of being a natural development.
Yeah, me too. Anyway, I think we are approaching the recording time limit for this session. And I think the answer that we gave to that question was, at least from my point of view, satisfying. And I think whoever asked that question would have a very good answer and something to contemplate on. Yeah. But anyway, I think that is enough for today. So thank you all for your attention. If you have any follow-up questions concerning this format or the content of this video, then feel free to put it down in the comments below. But until then, I wish you all a pleasant day, and until next time.